Hello there everyone, this is Mr. Brass, and now I will be going more into Horace Bushnell and his beliefs, where he came from, and just giving his overall method of how he approached biblical interpretation. To be a Congregationalist back in his day was essentially to be a New Englander and share the common history and to participate in its social institutions. He believed that American history began with the Pilgrims, and the New England values were the values that created the U.S. For him, he believed that each individual is born into a web of institutions with human relations and obligations. He did have some socially conservative beliefs, like how he believed that motherhood was a great duty and that women shouldn't forsake it for voting or running governments. Institutions set limits on individual choices but didn't believe they overwhelmed individuality of people. Bushnell seen religious truth as a force that eludes precise definitions, but avails itself through the power of poetry. Common sense epistemology construed knowledge of God to be rational and immediate, and Bushnell said instead it was affective and mysterious. Language to him can only partially express truth. Words are born out of the sensible world to him, and words of thought refer metaphorically to sensible objects, like how the word spirit literally means breath. Contradictions only reveal the limited capacity of language to describe transcendent truth. To summarize, in effect, Bushnell's method permitted him to make a broad distinction between the spirit of the Bible and its letter, and even at times the letter of some passages of Scripture. Furthermore, Bushnell found that the spirit that lived within the language of Scripture continues to dwell within nature and in human history. In order to discern the spirit, one had to be open to the truth that is available outside of the Bible. Bushnell's method said that emotion was at least equal to reason in terms of truth. Hodge was more against emotion-laden stories about the abuse of slaves, as he felt it supplanted reason, while Bushnell respected emotions as an important moral indicator. To understand slavery, according to Bushnell, you had to draw out the portrait of the domestic slave trade and portray how the experience has to be like. He rejected biblical legalism as he felt that it led to fruitless debates from pro-slavery people who go to the Bible to justify their slavery, and abolitionists who, if they don't reject the authority of Scripture, have to torture a reading that says slavery was never permitted in the Old or New Testament. His open to truth from everyone attitude made him embrace pseudo-scientific ideas about African inferiority, though. Bushnell understood biblical laws to be indirect reflections of God's perfection, and thus only the numinous principle of virtue was pure. To him, even biblical laws could permit actions that weren't free from the taint of evil. God can accommodate limitations of a particular time and place and made laws that are the best the people he's giving them are capable of. Bushnell defined slavery as a practice that's basically harmful and what God permitted as an accommodation to tame barbaric slave owners, not necessarily to restrain slaves. Basically, enslaving one's enemies was more humane alternative than killing/torturing them, and so God permitted it to tame men's instincts. Bushnell argued that the institution of slavery itself was evil, not just how it was currently being practiced like how Hodge felt. Slavery to Bushnell necessarily created an imbalance of power that created legalized selfishness that demoralized anyone involved in it. While he couldn't condemn all instances of slaveholding, he pointed that even the most humane slaveholder who held slaves, say, in order to protect them from harm, could not be entirely sure that their actions were pure. He did believe blacks should have the vote. To him, biblical laws permitted slavery as a humane accommodation to barbarism, but those circumstances no longer held the same principles of virtue. Bushnell's organic language united humans in a web of natural obligation and allowed him to appeal to the common feelings of humanity, which could be pleaded for in the welfare of slaves. It was certainly a social sin which corrupted institutions, but not necessarily always a personal sin. It did, however, have a dark side, as it gave him an essentialism towards race. The family was the most influential community, with children organically connected to their parents, and the family's influence on the individual spanned generations. This means the personality of each individual is determined by pedigree, and to him, because we are a large web of human solidarity with social networks, white Anglo-Saxons are superior, as they are the one race that had centuries of right nurture. To him, while individual Africans may thrive, the African race as a whole would gradually go extinct in America, just like the Native Americans. He held this position even after the Civil War. He was more unique in placing so much value on alleged natural conduits of race. Hodge didn't lend race the same theological importance. It is impossible to say who was more racist between Hodge and Bushnell. One could, in theory, judge their racism not just by their particular racial theories or opinions they hold, but their actions and use of political and personal power. In that respect, Bushnell might be a better friend for blacks, as he did have respectful relationships with them, even if he did view their extinction as inevitable once slavery ended. Hodge set limits on the significance of racial differences, as God could be a force to level such racial inequalities. Their social visions did have a lot in common, though, as they tempered love of freedom with a love of order, and ultimately believed slavery was incompatible with their social visions. Bushnell, unlike Hodge, didn't believe in deontology, but rather he had a goal-centered moral orientation. He had the freedom to articulate moral policy based on practical consequences and adapt moral rules so to pursue worthy goals. Hodge evaluated aspects of Southern slavery based on whether they cohered with biblical laws and theory, whereas Bushnell did so based on their consequences in practice and whether they cohered to the goal of a virtuous republic. Bushnell couldn't see slavery in the abstract like Hodge, but rather observed it as a concrete social practice with real consequences. Fugitive slave laws to Bushnell sought to manipulate the interests of Northerners and demoralize them by forcing them to capture slaves and return them to Southerners out of their own pocket. He blamed African inferiority on environmental factors like slavery and white oppression. He still believed that blacks would go extinct after the war, but was more open to God reversing that and blacks becoming talented members of society. He didn't believe that Africans becoming Christians dissolved racial boundaries, and didn't come to the 20th century notion that race is a social construct and thus not an essential truth. To Bushnell, racial differences were a set of barriers even God couldn't overturn, even though he could do good work by it. As you can see, Hodge and Bushnell were both anti-slavery to different degrees, and they did share some political opinions overall, but their theology was different, and they were both racist, which, like their anti-slavery positions, was to varying degrees. They both knew that the Civil War was about saving the Union and not about ending slavery per se for the North, even if the ending of slavery was a byproduct of the war. Their differences came about in how they went about dealing with the slavery issue. Hodge, despite being anti-slavery and believing that Christian love would eventually win out over the issue, he often was liked by the pro-slavery South because he went after abolitionists who said all slavery was sin. Bushnell saw the institution as essentially evil, and while he modified his racial extinction of blacks views, he never completely got away from them. What made them ultimately different was their religious views. It shaped how they dealt with the issue. Hodge believed slavery was a temporary measure and was against racial slavery as it was used to push for permanent social inequality. It should be admitted the views both men held in many ways in spite of their personal feelings. In the next video, I will be going more over how Hodge viewed the matter of slavery and to summarize his positions. Alright, well, that is all for today. This is Mr. Brass saying goodbye and get wise.